On this episode of AV Week, getting help outside your geographic area, what it takes to pull off major projection mapping projects, and when to keep secrets and when to not sign an NDA. All that and more. Next on AV Week.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
This is AV Week, episode 366, recorded Friday, August 31st, 2018. Don't hurry.
Support for AVNation is brought to you by
Sure, because every voice matters.
And by Extron Electronics.
This is AV Week, your weekly wrap-up of audio-visual news and information. My name is Tim Albright. I am your host. With us to talk about the news and information we have gathered this week. One of the nicest and one of my gentlemen I know, and one of my mentors in business and AV. His name is Brock McGinnis, and he is with Westbury National. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me back, Tim. Always a pleasure to be on AV Week.
Absolutely, sir. Appreciate your time. Also with us is Big Nate Schneider. He is a AV professional in his own right, but he also has a very fabulous podcast on AV of his own. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me, Tim. Look forward to talking shop today.
Absolutely. Nate's podcast is AV Shop Talk, so that was very nice. Also with us, gentlemen, it was very nice. Yeah, very. You get that right now. Gentlemen, I'm going to be spending a little bit of time with next week. His name is Dennis Holzer, and he is from Powerhouse. Welcome, sir.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. All right, guys. So kicking off here, an article that we had actually from Commercial Integrator, talking about getting help from outside of your network. How about that? Outside of your area. It's written by John Sormer, and John talks about a number of different ways you can get help, outside of your area. But one of the things that I want to talk about, and Brock, I want to start with you on this, is defining success, right? Defining the success criteria of a subcontractor, which is kind of what we're talking about, is making sure that expectations are written down, whether that's contract and depending on how big your business is and how you guys want to do it. But, making sure that the expectations are written down and, they fulfill it and you fulfill it. Westbury has kind of been on both sides of this. So how do you guys make sure that both sides are happy once the project is done?
Dealing with a subcontractor is identical to dealing with a client. You have to have a scope of work and a defined set of technical expectations. And, the same kind of document that a consultant might write for a tendered bid project in terms of technical expectations, or we might agree with a client in terms of exact scope of work and who's doing what and when and where and how and why, is what we use with a subcontractor. And when we act as subcontractors for other companies in the Toronto and actually across Canada, we expect exactly the same thing. We don't want a bill of materials and a set of plans. We want to know where our work starts and where it stops, where the prime contractor's work starts and stops, and exactly what's expected of us. And if everybody goes into a relationship knowing what is expected of you, it makes that relationship a lot easier to manage.
Well, let me ask this because you said using a subcontractor is a lot like your relationship with your client. How then do you handle what will inevitably come down the pipeline? Not every project, but a lot of projects have change orders, right? Is that the same kind of process then when it comes to the sub?
Exactly the same process. The client makes a change, and if they were giving it to us as a prime contractor, we're going to adjust the bill of materials and the labor requirements and potentially the time for completion. We have to go through the same process with a subcontractor. And typically, when we use subs, we're on a fixed price basis, defined scope of work, defined bill of materials, defined execution process, and a defined price. And so if it's going to take them more time, we need to be paying them more money.
All right. Nate, same kind of question here is how do you guys work around it and work them into your projects and getting them on site?
Yeah, I liked what Brock said. I agree 100%. It's, the scope of work, having a clearly defined expectation of what you expect. And I think he also hit on relationship too. I think, the project managers that are down in the trenches and on site and kind of overseeing the project, I think they have to have maybe slightly different mindset when they're working with full-time employees compared to, a contractor. And I think it's just a different relationship to manage. And, I guess if a project manager is used to working with a full-time crew all the time, and then all of a sudden they hire a contractor for the first time, there's definitely new things to think about. It's just a different type of relationship to manage. I think that's probably the best way I would describe it, just from my experiences in the past. And sometimes you might have to do different things to hold people accountable for what they agreed to, or there can be gray lines at times. And unlike, you're on a job site and it's the 11th hour, it's not quite all buttoned up. A full-time employee is probably motivated to get that done, whereas a contractor may or may not be. And I think it goes back to the scope of work and the relationship, and everybody understands, what the goal is. But I think it goes really to the project manager. It falls kind of on their shoulders to wrap their head around.
Yeah. Dennis, Powerhouse Alliance, Dennis is the head of, is a nationwide group of folks. You guys have dealers connected all over the country. Is this something that you guys can help, connect, folks in Boise, Idaho with somebody in St. Louis?
Absolutely. It's one of our big jobs that we are doing, because we have, specifically in the builder business now, where you have a builder who, you go back several years, didn't want to be involved in the electronics aspect of any building. Now, all of a sudden, because compression has hit them too in the profitability side, now, they're more, willing to listen. I think the one, we look at this, obviously, because of what we do, we're on the flip side. We're more on the product and the training side from Nate and Brock. And, one of the biggest dilemmas we find consistently is there is a defined project. There's a defined materials. Yeah, there's defined labor, and there's a defined cost to get a product done. The biggest problem we find is that if you take 10 installers to get from A to Z, they may do it 5 or 6 different ways. And that's where we run into the biggest problem helping installers, because they say we got to get from here to here. And we look at some of the things, and when they're on a fixed labor or they're on a fixed cost, I hate to say it, but sometimes they want to, cut costs in their own way, the way they get from A to Z. So I think one of the things we try to tell people when we're matching up people is be very specific, not only in what the goal is and what the expectations are, but we go as far as to add, what is the road you're going to use to get from A to Z?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, our next story here comes to us from our friends over at AV Magazine. The largest permanent digital projection mapping system is coming up in Chicago, actually just north of me. It's actually being put onto the Mercantile Mart building there in Chicago. It's put together by some folks out of San Francisco called the Obscura Digital working in conjunction with Chicago architects, Valero, DeWalt, Train, and Associates. And here's the quote I actually want to bring up here. They're doing this as part of an $8.5 million renovation, and they're using 34 Christie Boxer 4K 30 projectors. Now, this would be beyond any job I've done. Brock and Westbury have put together a bunch of very nice ice projection mappings. My personal favorite still is the Toronto Blue Jays, the Toronto Maple Leafs, even though I'm a Blues fan. Still one of the slickest projection ice mapping I've seen done. Nate, we'll start with you on this. When it comes to jobs of this size, and I guess it's a bit like the elephant, how on earth do you take this apart, and how do you get something like this done?
How I would do it. So I've been a designer for a long time. I've never, done a system exactly like this, doing projector mapping per se. But my first thing after reading this article was looking up the specs on the Christie Boxer, and I'm like, okay, first things first. That's over 5,000 pounds of just projector that you have to install somewhere across the river. So they've obviously got a lease space across the hall. So I guess that's the first thing I'd look at is what space do you have to look at to do this install? How do you pull this thing off? And, power requirements. And I go down the typical design type of mentality to pull this off. The other big thing is service, because, this is going to have a huge impact, for people that are walking down the Riverwalk in Chicago and they're projecting across this river. It's also going to be a huge opportunity to see a blue screen of death if things go wrong. So, I would be heavily focused on the maintenance of a permanent install like this and making sure all 6 of those bulbs are replaced well before they get close to dying, and having staff nearby that can service it as needed to make sure. And I think they talked about it would be running, not 7 days a week, but like 4 days a week or something like that. So it would be turned over every week for routine maintenance. So I think those are the things that I would think about.
That makes a whole lot of sense. Dennis, from your standpoint, how do you get manufacturers? This project used Christie, but there's other manufacturers as well that could have been used in this project. How do you get manufacturers on board to help in not just the design, but also the installation and as Nate said, some of the maintenance?
One of the things we do, first of all, is we reach out to our vendors and make sure they are a part of it. And, this is going to sound funny, but make sure they want to be a part of it. Just as he said, there are some guys who might look at this and say, well, this could be either a great thing or, man, this could look like a disaster if something goes wrong. Any maintenance issues, in this thing. So, the first thing we do, as I said, we reach out to our manufacturers. We ask if they want to be part of it. I'm a stickler on things like this. It's not individual conversations. If I'm using multiple vendors to do something, I'm getting them all together in one place, so there's no I said, he said, they said. Everybody hears the same thing, and we move forward. And again, I'm tougher than most on this, but I'm not moving forward until I feel very comfortable that we're all on the same page.
All right, Mr. McInnes, we'll end with this conversation with you again, because Brock's one of the folks I pick his brain when it comes to projection mapping. What are the do's and don'ts and what are the gotchas when it comes to a system like this, and not just from a projection mapping standpoint, but also a size and scope?
Don't hurry. There's a tremendous amount of planning that needs to go into it from both the content perspective and from the technical execution perspective. Generally, Dennis, it's if you're talking about $3 million worth of projectors, it's not all that difficult to get the manufacturer involved. They're typically quite excited about that. But this is it's a complex job, and one of the things that somebody has had to do is calculate the amount of light that is required in order to cover that apparent 2.5 acres. And I find it interesting because from our perspective, Tim, the best projection mapping in the NHL and NBA right now is at the Pepsi Center in Denver. And we used 16 of those same projectors on a hockey rink that they're using 34 of them on a building that is 500 and something feet wide by 25 stories high. So if you do the math on that, one of my first questions is, have they got enough projectors? The second thing that the article had the position, a kind of a graphic with the position of the projectors on it. And oh my gosh, they are not in the center of the building. And so some of those projectors, the kind of warp factor that is going to be involved in order to make that happen is going to be at the extreme end of what the projector is capable of. And so the Obscura folks will have spent a great deal of time on that kind of technical planning and analysis, I hope. And they're not making it up when they get there. Power, certainly the availability of power is one thing. Robust networking. This is the kind of project that when we do it, we have live IP monitoring on it at all times when it's operating. We are monitoring and able to monitor the back end of the equipment so that we can make adjustments on the fly as required, or have the kind of diagnostics if something does go wrong. We were involved supplying Christie projectors to the Canadian Parliament buildings, which are only about 80 feet narrower than the merchandise mart, because when they said they were going to be the largest in the world, I actually went and checked. And it's a complicated thing, and it involves live operators, and it's not for the faint of heart. We've seen an awful lot of companies think that they can do this. Companies like Christie Digital have added software programs for the blending. They're Mirage, and we think those programs are great, but they are not as good as people who've done this before, and done it well, and done it more than once or twice. So this is going to be an interesting project. I would love to be there for the opening. We just lit up some buildings in a smaller city in Ontario called Cambridge. To great extent, we had to build an outdoor structure. This is something that will operate through the Canadian winter. It is completely unmanned or unpersoned, and runs automatically, and runs I think it's maybe just weekends in the winter, but lights up the front of a 150-year-old library building, and it's very cool. And there's audio that goes with it. We have wireless audio through a big town square, and I certainly know the amount of time that our folks spent planning that before it was executed, and the huge hardware, the cooling and heating in the winter, and air handling, and all of the factors that go into something like this. Magnificent opportunity for someone in the AV industry to be involved with a project of this magnitude, and those folks, good on them. They're going to have a good time.
Well, I actually want to pick your brain one more time about the logistics of doing an outdoor system like this, because you mentioned the map that's on the article that'll be on the site. You can take a look at it. But it's across the street, right? Not to be silly. It's almost obvious that it's across the street, but it's across the street in downtown Chicago, where traffic happens and things of that nature. What else do you guys have to do when it comes to a system like this, where you are projection mapping onto a building? Mm-hmm. Who do you have to kind of coordinate with to make sure that the signal isn't interrupted?
Well, we're not worried about the signal. The players will be right there. There would be a lot of municipal permissions that
maybe not signal
are required.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said signal, but the beam, the light from the projector, that's not interrupted, I guess.
Drone shadow puppets.
Yes, we can't control the helicopters, but I'm sure that the positioning was quite carefully chosen. That trucks aren't in the way. They're not. Nothing is going to be driving by, and if it is, it's only for a moment. And who knows? Maybe somebody clever will come up with a way of interrupting that beam and getting themselves in the newspaper. But generally, no, that's not the consideration. Is the projector going to work? Is there power? Is there content? Is there network? And will it be too distracting to traffic? Because that is certainly, we have some regulations here about where people can be distracted and where they can't. You don't necessarily want drivers looking at the building as they're driving down the street adjacent to it. That can be counterproductive from a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, last story here comes to us from SCN and AV Network, and it comes to us from a familiar source here at AVNation. Bradford Ben writes about loose thinking ships, and what he's talking about is his propensity for NDAs. Quote, unquote, I prefer that NDAs be signed by all parties involved, even if it's company-wide. The main reason is that I feel that if it helps all the people understand the seriousness of the agreement. If everyone does not understand the requirements, how can the conditions be met? Bradford also goes on to talk about how you should not assume that on the other end, in other words, the other parties or the other companies signing the NDA, that they know of the NDA, or they know what they're talking about. And really, there's a couple different things. Bradford works for a significant company, a Fortune 100 company, and they're in the process of, they do things constantly that require not necessarily secrecy, but make sure that everybody understands that this is not for public knowledge yet. Dennis, I'm going to start with you on this because this is not something that you're unfamiliar with being where you are. How do you make sure that everybody, not only within Powerhouse Alliance, but also some of your dealers, making sure that they are on the same page as making sure that, this is not for public consumption until such and such date?
So, it's a real interesting topic for me, starting with both of my daughters are lawyers.
Oh, well, there you go.
So I am typically schooled and hear from them both that, Dad, you're not a lawyer. But, the one thing, I think we've gotten too open with this and making people sign everywhere. One of the things I often get, Tim, is where a company comes to me and asks me to sign it because they want to show me a product that they're working on. And the problem is most of those agreements, some of the companies right now are getting bold enough, which I will not sign, where they're asking for 3 to 5 years. And, my point is that I'll give you 6 months. But the way technology moves, they have a product that they feel today is going to be something different than other people have. It is so open-ended because if somebody comes out with that, if I sign one for hypothetically in 6 months and another vendor comes out with something like that in 3 months, I potentially could be sued for giving up information, even though I may never have spoken to that company. So I think we're getting too broad with these things, and I think there is a place for them, but they have to be well-defined, just like our opening topic here. If it does require this, then there needs to be a starting point, a finishing point, and the highway of which you get from A to Z needs to be written down. They're all, I just, and I'll say the company, but I did one with Sony not too long ago. It was so broad that I laughed at the lawyer and I said it encompasses the world. And I would not sign it. And, this took about 3 weeks. That went from 9 pages ultimately went down to a page and a half. So I think we're getting carried away with what we're doing here. I think there is a need at times for it, but it has to be a lot more specific and targeted than the ones they're really putting out right now.
Mr. McInnes, when it comes to NDAs and making sure that not only with your clients, but also sometimes manufacturers approach integrators and ask them to take a look at products and give feedback. Does that make sense for integrators to be able to kind of have a sneak peek at what's coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, we don't care. About a manufacturer's NDA, it's really what they're typically looking for is some feedback on cost and performance, and they're doing a little clever pre-marketing, and making you feel part of a special club by giving you a sneak peek. But we're signing NDAs with clients every day. The people at XYZ Corp, they don't want us talking about anything that we learn in the course of executing their project. And of course, in the government world, there are things that are more serious than NDAs. We have scenarios where only certain people in the company can access data. That data is not stored on our regular system. It's not stored in Dropbox where we normally store things. It's stored someplace else. Only certain people have passwords and have the secret level clearances. Brad makes a really good point about the essence in this social media look at me world, about the necessity of NDAs and about everybody talking about them, because you get an employee who's working on a really cool project and they decide they're going to tell their mom on Facebook about what they're working on, and all of a sudden it is out there in the world, and as an employer we're liable for their actions, and it's a big deal.
Well, real quickly before we get to Nate on this, you said that there are clients that are asking you to sign NDAs. Is that before you ever get the project, even when you're bidding on it, or is it something?
Correct.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can't say that we're bidding on it.
Wow.
especially companies that, that might be fruit shaped or, but they don't want anybody to know anything about what they're doing. Part of which, because it impacts competitive advantage, part of which it impacts the stock market, and they can't be perceived to be conveying insider information to parties or another. So they're not just disclosure. There are certain actions. If we know about some big thing that's happening, and that might compel us to go out and buy some stock in that company, we are insider trading at that point, and have signed off in writing that is the case. So information not available to the public. It's a big deal, and social media has made it instantaneous and irreparable. You can't take those things back. I'd seen a note on on Twitter today from a friend in the industry that said, think very carefully before unfriending somebody on Facebook, because it's one of those things in life that you can never take back or fix.
No, absolutely.
And in business.
Nate,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think they have like a mute feature now where you can just like mute someone on Facebook for a couple days, and they'll eventually come back if you get frustrated with their political views.
You can do it longer than a couple of days. Not that I would know that.
Yeah.
Nate, actually, Brock brings up a good point about social media. How do you keep that then? Is it something where you just have a real good, an old boss of mine used to call it come to Jesus meeting, where you say, look, look, guys and gals, this is what's happening when we're on this site. We're either going to confiscate your phones or this, and how do you keep it when you've got, a team working on a project?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to think hypothetically. It's not a situation I've been in recently where I've had to think about that with an NDA, but I've heard stories from people that work. Well, it's not so much NDA, but more security when they're working in certain places in the Middle East. But I think it comes down to what the purpose of the NDA is, and I think Brock and Dennis kind of touched on that. Where is this like a marketing thing to build hype, or is this to make people feel like they're part of a special club, or is there something more? Is it like a security thing? Or I don't know. There could be different reasons for it. I guess I would ask a question to you, Tim. When you got flown out, or you flew out to Virginia for the AVIXA unveiling, did they make you sign an NDA, or was that a different type of legal document? Because I know a whole bunch of people flew down, and then it was like 6 p.m. on a Tuesday that you could officially talk about the news after their press conference. Was that an NDA, or was that something different?
So I'll go through it as much as I can, and actually Brock was there as well, so I'll pick on him too. We didn't know. We had no clue. We had zero clue as to what it was about. And I believe that the NDA has expired, so I can talk about this now. But they simply asked us if we were available, right, on a certain date. It was actually almost a year ago now, because it was the week after CEDIA. And we get there, and they bring us into a room, they do a presentation, and they had us sign an NDA, I believe at that point, and it had a specific time that day, if I'm remembering correctly. Again, it was a year ago, but it wasn't a very long, it wasn't a very long NDA, but it was an NDA for that day, and there was a time when they could do it, and the time actually coincided with when they were doing the presentation with the influencers and other media or other AV professionals that they had brought in for this event. Which was a part. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting to me. So yeah, I don't really have too much more other insights to offer on NDAs. I just haven't had enough experience with it. I guess I'm curious about it. What I've typically been involved with is just confidentiality agreements, non-competes, things like that, but not so much like a specific NDA.
Very good. All right, guys, that is going to wrap it up for us as we all head off for the weekend. Mr. Brock McGinnis, thank you so much, sir, as always.
Pleasure, Tim. And sorry it's been so long since I've been available to be to be back anytime, sir.
It's the summer. How do people, I get it. How do people find you and or Westbury, sir?
We're at westbury.com. I'm brock.m at westbury.com and at Brock McGinnis on Twitter, where every once in a while I spend a bunch of time.
Yeah, it depends. Also, Mr. Nate Snyder, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim. It's been fun talking with you. People can look me up. I do a monthly podcast called AV Shop Talk, and I share my thoughts on AV technology and sometimes have interesting guests on. And lately, not so many guests, mostly just me coming up with interesting things to say. But love talking with people, meeting people in the industry, networking. And it's a fun and exciting industry to be part of.
Yeah, it's something else that Nate does that's pretty cool. That anytime he goes to Infocom, he'll do and he'll interview folks. When he's out and about, and that's usually one of my favorite ones to listen to. So check it out. Also, Mr. Dennis Holzer from Powerhouse Alliance. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back. I can be got at dholzer@powerhousealliance.com. Certainly, the group can be got at powerhousealliance.com. And Tim, I guess I'll see you next week as we head into CEDIA for a week worth of what they're saying is new technology.
Yeah, it's going to stink. It's in San Diego, and
it is really rough. The weather is going to be tough, so
terrible.
I feel your pain, and we're all going to have to put up with it.
You know what? As much hoo-ha, different things that we go to around the country and around the world. This has been the last year it was in San Diego. This year it's in San Diego. I don't believe it's in San Diego again next year. So
Denver.
Denver. So I'm gonna enjoy this one. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. For me, don't follow me on the Twitters because the Bears season is not quite over yet, but it's close. NFL hasn't even started yet, and I recognize that, but still go Bears. Go by the website, though. Yeah, whatever. Go by the website, AVNation.tv. That's AVNation.tv. You'll find this program and a host of others. Dennis mentioned it. We will be at CEDIA 2018 from the 6th through the 8th of September, bringing you all the stuff from the show floor there. Also, check out our other weekly news program that Matt Scott does, talking about the residential market. Also, while you're there, we have a new webinar coming up about meeting room technology with Victoria Ferrari, Mike Shin, and Ernie Beck coming up at the end of September. So check that out as well. While you're there, please check out our underwriter section. These are the folks who help us financially and help support us to help us go to CEDIA and all the other shows that we do. So check that out, all that and more at AVNation.tv, AVNation.tv. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. That's all the time we have for AV Week.